later, but please, in order to have the good bandwidth and good connection, please do switch off your, keep your microphones on mute. So as I started presenting the IIMSR, the Institute is a non-partisan think tank and a scientific organization, which scope is to generate fact-based analysis and widen perspectives on current security issues. Generally, when we speak about the use of soft power, many of us include their cyber power and the cyber power exercised between states and other players. But today the webinar which is dedicated to the cyber warfare, international security and the future of conflicts. In this webinar, Dr. Topor, the speaker, will tell us another perspective and why power in cyberspace is not only soft. It is more dynamic, non-bound to distinct size and strengths, and can complement traditional soft and hard powers. Dr. Topor says that if power once laid in force, later in diplomacy and currency, now it lays in an innovative cyberspace. And a few words about the speaker today. Dr. Lev Topor is the Vice President of Research and Academic Affairs at IIMSR. He is an academic expert in topics related to cyber and in the field of antisemitism studies. He is also one of the few experts worldwide who are working on anonymous communications and dark webs. Dr. Topor is a senior research fellow at the Center for Cyber Law and Policy at Haifa University in Israel, and a senior business consultant in various private ventures. As a summary of the areas of his expertise, there can be summarized as cybersecurity, anti-Semitism studies, anonymous communications, and dark web. And just before we start, let me point some technical details. The presentation will last around 30-40 minutes, and for the comfort of all of the participants, please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. The webinar will be recorded, so if you have any concerns, please switch off your cameras as well. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so you can leave your questions and comments in the chat section. Depending on the time, we will get in as many as possible of the questions that you will ask. And just before giving the floor to Dr. Topor, I would like to thank you in advance for your interest and presence tonight, and to acknowledge the attendance of all of us, the attendance of the President of IIMSR, Commander Eyal Pinko, the Vice President, Mr. Avner Sar, and the founder and the chairman of IIMSR, Colonel Amir Goren. Also, I would like to thank for the marketing support and dissemination of our partners from CPE Terra. Dr. Topor, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you please all put your mics on mute?
Γι' αυτό. Θα έπαιζε μάτια και γυαλιά. Μήπως θέλει αυτή η γυαλιά.
Gentlemen, those who are with not with switched off microphones, please do this. Or Dr. Topor, if it's comfortable for you, can you do it?
Sorry.
Yes, can you please put your mics on mute, everybody, so we can just hear the lecture. Great, thank you. So let's begin. I assume you're all looking at the screen right now and at the presentation. Now today we're going to discuss cyber warfare in relations to international security and the future of conflict. What does it mean that the next few years will be defined by the cyber domain, and mostly by the cyber domain. Now, when we talk about cyber warfare, by the way, excuse me with my head shifting, I'm just using two screens, so I'm not looking at you. I'm just looking at the presentation and at the Zoom. So when we first talk about cyber warfare and we want to discuss and understand it thoroughly, we must understand several key theoretical issues. Now, I'll present you the structure of the presentation. which is we're going to talk about theory. Next, I'm going to present several case studies and discuss them, 3 case studies. And later on, the last part will be the statistical analysis of my current research of 500 case studies of cyber attacks and the analysis of them. So when we talk about cyber warfare, we need to understand what it is. And when I say what it is, I mean we need to discuss whether it is power, what kind of power it is, if so, whether it's an evolution or a revolution of the affairs of the international affairs, and what people and states and societies want to gain with the cyber domain and with cyber attacks and cyber warfare in general. So when we talk about power, so the basic definition is that power is the ability to do things and control others, to get others to do what they otherwise would not. That's the essence of it. Now, this ability is often associated with the possession of certain resources like territory and population and natural resources and economic size, strength, military forces, political stability, and so on. Now a neo-realist scholar would probably assume that power is hard. It's just guns and bombs and submarines and airplanes and nuclear weapons and so on. Now, the neoliberal would assume that power is soft. And then we're talking about the economy and education and so on. Now, when we combine these 2 types of power, we get something that is called smart power. Now, cyber is a smart power because it can be soft and it can be hard and it can actually be sharp. Now sharp power is the power with which non-democracies or less democracies, I should say, or more regulated states project their influence in terms of international security, and they take basically the advantage of the asymmetry between free, non-regulated and true democracies and less or non-democracies. So let's say that the US is way more vulnerable than Russia or China, simply because these two, the latter, regulate their cyberspaces. Now, the US and the EU and the UK and so on, they are all free political platforms, and they're more bound to foreign manipulations and influences and so on. I would actually saw it in the US elections and with Brexit and with the NATO issues in the Baltic states and in Europe and Ukraine and so on. Now, when we talk about power, traditionally states got to test their power through war. They threw bombs at each other and shot at each other and so on. So later on, during the second half of the 20th century, this definition of hard power, the expression and exercise, actually shifted towards a softer stand, emphasizing technology and education and economic growth and so on. So the softer power became far more significant than traditional power as the norms, using brute force, and the use of brute force declined. So let's say that if states were traditionally the main actors, if we're talking about soft power and the shift towards it in the international arena, then with the years and with the development of the global societies, states had far less influence, and individuals and organizations, and as you all know, terror groups as well, had far more influence than states in several occasions. Now the examples of terror groups and organizations are obvious, but if I say that even individuals have gained significant influence in the cyber domain, in the cyber age, sorry. Now I don't say it I don't say it as something that just from the theory. I'm saying it from actual events. Now, if you look at the leaks of Edward Snowden, for example, US PVD-20, and Julian Assange, who founded the WikiLeaks and so on. So we can see that even with a few mouse clicks, individuals, you, me, your friends, and so on, can tremendously impact politics and even international affairs. Now, in 2019, the Department of Department of Defense, the DoD in the US, they assigned a list of threats, and the cyber threat, interestingly, was presented before in the list. It was presented before the nuclear threat and before the terror threat and so on. So so we can see that even one of the greatest and most powerful players in the international arena actually assigned cyber as its main threat. So okay, so that's about power. Now, is it a revolution or an evolution? We can see the next box in the slide. So cyber warfare is just warfare. I mean, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, states used to, people and societies and villages and kings and states and so on, used to fight each other. And the fact is that they are still doing this. Nations and groups still are engaged in too many conflicts, of course. And the cyber domain is just another, perhaps technological revolution, perhaps scientific revolution, but it's definitely not a thematic revolution in the context of war, because of war and conflict, because conflict is still going on. It doesn't matter whether it's with bombs and guns and airplanes and submarines, or whether it's with malicious code and hackers and gigantic servers and so on. So it's definitely not a revolution. It's just an evolution of the affairs. Plus, the evolution has some benefits, because you can I'll just present the control issue in a second, but you can control something without having to actually kill someone. Okay, you can influence him, you can manipulate him and so on, but you don't have to kill or physically harm him. So when we talk about control, we have to ask the next question: control over what? I mean, we've got, okay, so let's say that we've got power, but what do we do with this power? So the power is that A can player or actor A can control actor B and so on. Okay, so that's fine, but what does he want to control? So the scope of power and influence of any actor over another is limited, and so he wants to control different aspects. And what I mean by different aspect is that they want to control the actual either actor or the actual resources of the actor, or his outcomes and events. So a resource may be perhaps water or energy and so on. That's obvious. The actual actor, the control over the actor, is again, it's quite obvious, the control of somebody else. But the control of outcomes, and it is the hardest thing to get, obviously, the control over outcomes is the control of an outcome of an event or a war, or as we've seen in the last few years, of elections. So let's say that I'm state A and I look at state B. And I see that they are having their elections, and then I say, okay, they've got two candidates. One of them is bad for me, and the other one is better for me. So obviously, I'm going to try and intervene in some way. So so tens and hundreds of years ago, states used to intervene with different kinds of tactics. One of them is the use of military force, of course, and now they simply don't have to. Now they can either combine and make it a hybrid campaign, or they can simply influence and avoid a greater conflict, like the case with the US and Russia, or the Brexit in Russia, and so on. Now, the last box in the slide is attribution. Now, what I mean by attribution, the fact that the cyber domain is very secure, very anonymous, very private, makes it the perfect domain for proxy warfare. So let's say that I want to attack my adversary. So I don't have to attack him directly. I can ask a bunch of hackers, or I can ask another state to attack him. And then even if he finds out eventually who made the attack, so he won't be able to blame me. At least not in the sense that it's going to be binding and legal and embedded in the international law, because the fact is that today there's no whatsoever law regarding cyberspace and cyber warfare. So basically, you can do anything you want and get away with it. So when we look at countries like Russia and China and some countries in the Middle East and so on, it's only logical and it's only obvious that they are going to strategically use this domain, the cyber domain, for their own benefits. And the US is doing the same, and Britain is doing the same, and Europe is doing the same, and so on. So all over, countries are engaged in cyber conflicts without having to prove anything or suffer the consequences and so on, unless something goes terribly wrong, and they obviously cause the cyber attack to be physical and actual, like blowing up a bridge or a water reservoir or something like that, or a nuclear plant and so on. So that's the theory, that's the discussion, and that's the framework. Now, let's combine this with several actual case studies. Now, when I pick the case studies, I try to be as diverse as I can, but I wanted something very significant and something that correlates and relates, to the theoretical stuff about power and the measurement of power and proxy warfare and so on. So looking at the next slide, I've chosen 3 case studies. A case study about influence, a case study about a hybrid campaign, and another case about economic pressure or revenge, perhaps. We'll just discuss it in a minute. So the first case is the Russian fake news and influence campaigns in Sweden. So it's not just in Sweden, it's in Finland, and it's in Germany and Poland and in other nations, other countries in Eastern Europe. And why is that? So the case of Sweden is very interesting because Sweden collaborates with NATO, but it's actually not a member state of NATO. It's not a full member state. Neither is Finland. So what Russia did a few years ago, and it still keeps doing, is influencing through media, through social networks, through bots and trolls on Facebook and Twitter and many other social websites. What they are doing is actually making the Swedish people, leading them into a some sort of domestic chaos. So they are dividing the left and the right, the liberals and the conservatives. They are developing even sometimes racism and xenophobia, just for the sole purpose of keeping Sweden away from NATO. Now, obviously, that the US and Europe and NATO as a whole are trying to influence and bring Sweden and Finland and all the other countries in. So we can see that there's two sides that are trying to gather the Swedes' attention. So when they divide the Swedish society and they affect the elections, so they can manipulate Sweden into holding on with critical decisions. So if no critical decisions are made, then they won't join to NATO. So that's what they are doing. They are utilizing cyberspace for the purpose of holding the Swedes and keeping them away from NATO and away and apart from the rest of Europe and so on. They're obviously doing that. These acts in other countries, like I said, especially Finland as well. Okay, so that's about influence. Now the second case study, which I chose to discuss, obviously in just a few minutes about each, because we're limited in time, is actually a hybrid campaign. And I'm going to talk about the Russian cyber attack on the Ukrainian power grid in 2015. So about a quarter, even more of a million people, often quarter of a million Ukrainians had no electricity for hours and hours and hours. And it's very critical because there's no lights on the streets, and there's a lot of car accidents, for example, and there's no power in hospitals, and the whole economy, the whole commerce is completely shut down. So it's very problematic and very, the Ukrainians felt this very good. Let's just say it like this. So what they did is that they've tried to do a hybrid campaign. They didn't try, they succeeded, of influencing the Ukrainians on the one hand, and on the other hand, they tried to show them that they can manipulate and physically harm their economy and their society and their country and so on. So there's a sort of a supportive or even complementary pressure with the influence and the fake news and the media and so on. which is completely tactically, is completely the same as in Sweden, and alongside with the actual manipulation of the power grid. So as we can see, since 2015, things got much worse for Ukraine, much better for Russia, and the Russians did a very smart campaign in Ukraine. So they turned Ukraine upside down because they wanted to join the EU and they wanted to keep even more ties with NATO. And the Russians, since it's their backyard, simply put everything on hold in Ukraine and gained control. They gained influence. So they gained control on the actual actor, which is Ukraine, on their resources, which is energy, and the outcomes. Well, the outcomes are at their favor, but we will have to wait a few weeks or months and see what happens right now. So that's about Ukraine. Now, another very interesting case study is actually the case study of the economic pressure or the revenge. Now, I'm talking about the Sony Pictures hack in 2014. Now, the story goes like this. Sony Pictures made a movie about the North Korean leader, and they didn't like it. So they wanted to keep it out of screens, out of cinemas, out of theaters. So what they did is the North Koreans hacked and made very significant pressure, and they made Sony Pictures to just give up the whole idea about doing projecting the movie, going on with the movie as planned, and Sony Pictures completely halted and deleted their promotions of the film, and they brought it down. So they brought it down, and Sony Pictures is associated, of course, with the greatest movies of all times, and with the US and with the West and with the South Korea and so on. And the North Koreans, through a tiny hack of data manipulation, got all of those big guys, which are the US, South Korea, and the whole and Sony Pictures, obviously, to simply give up. So they obviously didn't do it on their own. They used a proxy. They used a group of hackers. So it was associated to North Korea. It was estimated that it was North Korea, but eventually they had no significant proof, and the group of hackers was blamed. So that's about Sony. So it's interesting because it's not a state versus state. It's a company or a group. Yeah, it's a group of hackers versus a company, and the company represents. Company is actually a proxy of all the big guys of the US, South Korea, and so on. And the hackers are a proxy of North Korea. So it's very interesting because it's a proxy war and not a direct type of war. Now, we've done our qualitative analysis, our case studies, and now let's look at the very interesting cases which I've analyzed of significant cyber attacks. And I've analyzed 500 of them. So let's have a look at the next slide. So what I did basically is analyze the the most significant case studies gathered by the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, between 2006 and 2009. So what I've done is very, very simple. I only used descriptive statistics and cross-tabulation, crosstabs. Now, it's very simple, but it's very enriching in terms of the findings. So we can find, for example, okay. So each cyber incident was divided into 4 categories, actually 4 questions. I've asked, let's go from right to left this time. So I've asked who did it, to whom, how, and for what. So when I say who did it and to whom, I mean whether it was an individual or a state proxy or a company or an organization and so on. And when I'm talking about the tactics, I've divided it into the most significant cyber tactics, which are espionage and propaganda and denial of service and data modification and sabotage and manipulation of data. And there was a lot of incidents with no significant information about them. So I just categorized it as a general hacking or phishing campaign. And that's it. And the question of control is what are they trying to control? Are they trying to control resources or actions and actors, or the whole thing, which is the event or the outcome? So looking at the next slide. Okay, so what the crosstabs actually tell us. Now, when I did the crosstabs, I found the connection between the tactics and the measurement of power. So what tactic is used to control actors and what tactic is used to control outcomes and so on. So that's the types of questions I've done. So and the second thing is I tried to discover the connections between the tactic and the type of perpetrator and the victim. It might sound the same, but it's not the same because a lot of times you will know who made the attack, whether it was a state or an organization or a state proxy and so on, but you won't know exactly who the victim is. And vice versa. A lot of times we can discover the victims, we can see the victims, but we are not able to discover the perpetrators. So if we can learn who the victims are and how they suffered, we can perhaps assume and have some suggestions about finding out who made this. So first, let's look at the descriptive statistics. Now let's look at the frequencies, and I've only highlighted the most significant numbers. So when we talk about the cyber warfare tactic, we can say that 170 times perpetrators made attempts of manipulation and sabotage. Now, another 120 times they made espionage attempts. And 207 times they made general hacking campaigns, which is with no significant information about them. So that's the most significant numbers, and it is highlighted. They're highlighted in yellow. Now, if we look at the denial of service, which is highlighted in green, we can ask ourselves. Let's all assume that we are the perpetrator. So if we want to attack, let's say, a company or a state or a website, okay? Yeah, let's use the example of a website. If we want to attack a website, so what will be the most beneficial tactic for us? Will it be espionage and manipulation, perhaps, or will it be denial of service? And that's why we can see the significant difference between the denial of service tactics and the rest of the tactics. So if you do a DDoS attack, then you shut down the website and nobody can use it. Not them, not you. So, but if you do several manipulations and try to steal data from it, okay, so you actually gain data and gain knowledge and gather intelligence. Can everybody please mute the mics? Yeah, okay, so I've muted him. So that's very interesting, the differences between the numbers and the tactics. Now let's have a look at what I found with the frequency of the question: control over what? Actors or outcomes or resources and so on. Now let's have a look at the percentage. The most significant measurement of power was resources. Now states and individuals and organizations and state proxies and so on, and terror groups, they all try to gain resources, which a lot of times are information or funds, for example, with ransom and so on. Now, what they didn't try or didn't try as much is the most hard thing to get, which is the outcomes and the events. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So now we ask the question of made by whom? By an individual or a company or a state or a state proxy and so on. So we can see that the majority of attacks were made by states and state proxies, and another significant number was made by individuals, which are a kind of a state proxy by themselves. So we can see that organizations and companies aren't as engaged in cyber warfare as states and their proxies. And when I say proxies, I mean anonymous hacking groups and so on. Okay, now the last slide of frequencies before we get to the crosstabs is the victims. Now, companies suffered 115 times. Individuals suffered 44 times. Organizations suffered 43 times, and the most significant number was, of course, associated with states. States suffered. If we combine all of the lines that have the states in them, then it's over 50%. Over 50% of states suffered from cyber attacks. So now let's have a look at the most interesting and significant findings of this research. Now, here's the crosstabs. We can have a look at this tab, and it says it combines the question of control over what with a tactic. So let's say, so the question I've asked here is, what kind of tactic should I use if I want to control resources or outcomes or actors and so on? So we can see that that when perpetrators tried to get resources, they used espionage. We can see it in the middle with the green arrows and the highlighted box. So when perpetrators done manipulation and sabotage, they also try to gain resources. So it's all about resources, which is money and electricity and information and so on. They've tried to control it, not steal it, but control it. So information you can steal, you can gather, but electricity you can shut down, as we've seen in the case of Ukraine and Russia in 2015. So another interesting crossstep I've made is the question of made by whom, whether what tactic was made most by what perpetrator. So we can see that states used a lot of espionage, 58 times. We can see that individuals, used manipulation as well, and the general hacking campaign was also used by individuals and states. So all the rest, all of the other numbers are very low and almost not significant enough. So that's why I didn't highlight them. But moving on to the last crossstep, we can see the crossstep that asks made to whom, who's the victim. So we can see that states suffered 54 times from espionage attacks, and states suffered 111 times from general hacking campaigns and phishing, and they suffered 53 times from manipulations. And companies, which are some sort of proxies as well of a state, also suffered from espionage and manipulations and so on. So if we compare the previous slide, when states actually made espionage, then we can see that states also suffer from cyber espionage. So that's another interesting finding. So that's about it with the crosstabs and the case studies. And now for the concluding words, I'm going to talk about 4 things, and now I'm going to talk about the future of conflict, of cyber conflict. So first, we've already mentioned that it's a very lucrative business, because you can do whatever you want. You can harm others in whatever way you like, and since there is no international law, you can pretty much always get away with it. I'm not talking about cyber criminals who are bounded to their local and domestic law. I'm talking about states or individuals who commit cyber crimes or cyber attacks on other states and other individuals in other places. And then there's a problem of jurisdiction, and then there's no binding law, there's no international law and no norms. So everybody is doing whatever they want. So what will the future of conflict will look like? Well, first, we are going to see far greater restrictions on the internet and on social media and on the entire web as a whole, simply because of the fact that asymmetry plays a crucial part in the international affairs when we talk about cyber warfare and the cyber domain. So if a state is now completely open and free, let's use the US example. So in a few years, they will probably regulate and monitor and restrict themselves in order to prevent influences like the presidential campaigns and so on. So states are already engaged in restrictions and monitoring. We can see Russia and Iran and China and North Korea, obviously, and so on. So we're going to see a much greater use of proxies because states don't want to engage directly, because then there's always the risk of escalation. Then from a cyber campaign, it can escalate to an actual campaign, which later on can, of course, escalate to a very severe regional or perhaps greater conflict. So nobody wants that. None of the state's citizens want it. So we're going to see use of proxies in the cyber domain and in general. Now, another issue is closing the cyber borders. So it relates to restrictions and the proxy warfare. So states will close their borders, and you can even imagine that the US will have its own social network, and Britain will have its own social network, and its own Facebook and or Twitter and so on. And of course, there is going to be some enormous global network and social network, but it's going to be very different from what we see today with Facebook and Twitter and so on. And lastly, about international law, we will probably see, I'm pretty sure about it, some kind of legal developments in the field of international law, because right now today there's no international law whatsoever regarding cyberspace, and it's a new innovative domain that must be restricted and regulated for the sole fact that it will prevent future conflicts and future cybercrime and so on. So that was my concluding remark. Thank you very much for being here, for listening, for having interest in the topic of cyberspace and cyber warfare. And now, please, if the organizers want to say a few words or ask questions, I'm all ears, and I can answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Topor, for the insightful presentation and the research results that you presented in front of us. It is really pleasure, and it was very interesting and educative what you just presented in front of us. Please, all the guests, you can post your questions in the chat section. Among the appreciation that we get from your presentation, here there is one question. And to you, is there any possibility of international humanitarian law being expanded to cyber conflicts, such as the Tallinn Manual on the international law applicable to cyber warfare?
Okay, so do you want me to answer this question, or do you want to gather several others?
I think while gathering others, we may use the time to.
Okay, sure. Okay. So the Tallinn Manual is a draft, a very interesting draft, but it's obviously not binding. It's a book. It's a Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. It was released by Cambridge University Press. Everybody in the field of cyber conflicts and war read it. They know it, but it's not binding. It's not the actual law. So I suggest that we will see some kind of development. It's a first draft, and it will definitely help the future process, future legal process. But we have to remember that in order to get the most out of any law, we have to make members compliant. So when I say members, I'm obviously talking about all the big actors, all the powers, the US, Russia, China, and the EU as a whole, Britain, some countries in the Middle East, some countries in Southeast Asia, Japan perhaps, Brazil, in South America perhaps, and so on. But we have to gather as much support as possible. Otherwise, if one big player, let's say Russia or China or the US, won't agree with the law, there's going to be no law, and then we'll be stuck with the current situation as it is. But since it harms all of them, I assume that in a few years we will see some developments.
Thank you very much. And because we advanced quite a lot with the time, I can propose to move to the closing remarks and to open the discussion for everyone who would like to discuss or share inputs and insights, to share them with IIMSR at our office email or social media account. And thank you very much, Dr. Topor, for the interesting presentation and your valuable input. We hope that this event contributed to a better understanding of the topic to all our participants today. And dear guests, if you would like to attend more such events organized by IIMSR, you can follow us on the social media channels and follow the recent updates on our website www.iimsr.eu. On the question if the webinar is recorded, yes it is, and soon it will be uploaded in our YouTube channel. And for those who don't know it, we will send, for those who registered for the event, it will be sent as a follow-up email. Once again, thank you very much for your attention and participation today. Stay safe and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you very much.